and welcome to episode 6 of Biologize. Today I'm going to be talking about leadership and behaviour, inspiration from nature that can help us think differently about how we deal with the complexity of today's business world. I'm going to start talking about the issues we have around leadership, and then take us into looking at Business Biomimetics, which is a research-based method taking biological systems and applying their thinking to strategy, innovation and change. I'll then finish by explaining about the past casting model and walk you through an application of that. So if we think about leadership, and more importantly the behaviours that sit around leadership, we are faced with a number of complex challenges in a dynamic workplace which impacts your private sector, public sector, third sector, charity, small and medium enterprise, technology enterprise, business services enterprises, a number of factors which are continually creating a changing and dynamic environment. This means that some of the traditional methods that we might have used for leadership development and the management of teams and the creation of high performance teams and the behaviours that sit around it may no longer be applicable. And today what I'm going to take you through is an example of how we can think about these things in a different way. Nature is a brilliant source for inspiration. Organisations that look at nature and apply it in a scientific way around the challenges they face have often expressed both surprise and delight in the different way people think, the different way teams start to work together, the different ideas that are had, and the different way those ideas are implemented. Business Biomimetics is a research-based method developed in the UK to help businesses understand the challenges they face and to take lessons from nature to help them solve them in a different way. If we think about nature in its fullest sense, it's had about 3.8 billion years worth of R&D effort, and it's been solving very complex problems in complex, dynamic, changing environments for a very long time. And this is why nature perhaps is a better source of the inspiration that we need than perhaps the more traditional management tools that were developed on an industrial, methodical, process-based way. To get us started, we perhaps need to reset how we drive our own behaviour, and then we can use nature as a way of informing that set of principles which we can then use. So let me run you through some ideas from nature that can help us. Nature tends to use waste as a resource. It uses materials very sparingly, and where there are different types of pressures, it'll either diversify, change, or it'll coalesce and collaborate. It tends to use energy, both gathering it and using it very efficiently, and it focuses on optimization, not maximization. The idea here is just good enough is much better than perfect, because just good enough means that you can continue with your purpose, whereas perfect means you're striving for something that may never exist. Nature runs on information, and it runs on information at a system level. It's designing future solutions to problems with reuse and recycling in mind, so it tends therefore not to create a pollution or non-utilizable resources. It's always working in balance with the biosphere, and it uses local resources. We can then think of these principles from nature as a way of helping us shape the way we behave around strategy, innovation and change. Solutions from nature, such as waterproofing in plants, where in fact the surface is counterintuitive and full of holes rather than a seamless waterproof covering, give us some insight in the way that nature thinks about the way of applying resources and structure in a different way. Examples include taking squid and understanding how it can change its colours, not by changing the whole skin, but by having sacs of ink that it then stretches to create a very thin film of colour underneath the skin. So the actual amount of resourcing and changing is done by small muscle changes rather than a massive effort under the skin. Jellyfish, which essentially use the sea to give them structure, have inspired robots that are much less dense in terms of material used. Balancing the water as a way of giving structure can now be used as autonomous vehicles to do undersea pipe checking, which would have typically before taken a huge amount of energy and people. Submersibles that are fin propelled rather than propeller propelled are much less disruptive in terms of cavitation, using much less energy. And what that means is that you can either use a smaller motor to drive the fin to get the same effect, or you can get a much better effect in the submersible with the same motor but with a fin as a propelling device. Work's been done in the US about how we can beam solar power back to Earth, probably as microwaves, because solar panels in space are about 7 times more effective. So what they can do is they can harness the energy and then beam it back down to the Earth's surface. And the arrays that are being used to structure and gather that are essentially an inverse of the compound eye that found in flies to capture light energy and focus that. So potentially in the future we could be in autonomous vehicles with microwave energy beamed down on demand to the vehicle from outer space. And then finally, hydrogen fixation, which typically uses platinum as a catalyst to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Work done in China looking at butterfly wings, and the intricacy of the nanostructure shows that a wing actually is full of holes. And if you create the platinum catalyst full of holes in a similar pattern, you can get anything up to 200% better conversion or better hydrogen fixation. So that's using the same material but structuring it in a different way. So if we start to think about how we generally as leaders solve problems and how nature solves problems, you start to see an interesting difference in the pattern. And if we think about a small problem to a very big problem, and we think about breaking down how we might solve it using either information or energy or cash if it's a business, time, how we use time, the way we use space, the way we use structure, and the way we use substance, mankind tends to have problems solved by using high amounts of energy and high amounts of substance. So we could translate that in a business context to typically people and cash. If you have a look at nature, nature has a very different profile. Nature tends to be very high on structure and information and very low on energy and relatively low on substance. So it creates, like the butterfly wing, an ability to have a structure which is robust, which can fly, which doesn't let air through, but actually is full of holes and is, by definition, therefore, lightweight in the use of material. So how can we use this to help us think about leadership and particularly the behaviours that we have? We can start to look at applications by examining some biological systems. So if we look at aphids or greenfly that live on plants, they have a life cycle of about 40 days, but they're continually generating clones. The females essentially generate clones of females, young females. So the female aphid is typically pregnant with another female aphid, and that female aphid is also pregnant with another female aphid. So in a 40-day life cycle, there can be anything up to 42 generations of aphids on their way alive, about to be born, or about to be born the pregnant aphid. We can apply that to service development, product development, portfolios, projects, and think, how are we going to dynamically create a portfolio of projects and programs which dynamically changes, and each project or program already has gestating within it the next project or program, so we no longer need to think about designing projects and programs, for example. If we then go on to look at aphids and the relationship with ants, ants that have a biological relationship with aphids tend to use them as farmers, and the aphids farm the sap for the ant, who stimulates the aphid by typically stroking its back, and then that releases additional sap, and the ants collect that and take it to their nests. This sap is used as a food source for the fungus that ants have in their nest, and that fungus is the food source for the nest itself. But you need to look after resources, and what ants do during the cold weather, when aphids would be subject to extreme temperature, is they take the eggs and they overwinter them in their nests. So come the spring, they can take them back out, put them back onto the healthy plant tissue, and start the cycle all over again. So if we combine the aphid and the ant model together, there's something about how do we generate future products and services and programs and projects which are already creating future projects, programs, products or services, and then how do we farm them so that we protect them under the different pressures. So this could be resourcing, say, where you've run a piece of work, you've got a key resource, you don't need them for a while, but you know something will come up in the future. How do you manage and work with that? Those biological systems can give you some really good insight into how to make that work. From a leadership behavior point of view, we're now not thinking about the traditional approach, but very much more thinking about different types of leadership behavior. So behaviors around thinking, combining, leveraging, dissolving, sensing, protecting and balancing. So you could have a chief thinker who's now focused completely on how do you keep everything alive, and importantly, how do we let go of the things that are no longer alive and not hang on to something that really isn't adding any value particularly, but more importantly is probably absorbing resources in terms of substance, resources in terms of cash, and not making intelligent use of space, time or information. How can we combine things to get maximum reuse? So nature tends not to design anything that can't be completely reused. How do we target using zero resource? So this might be free money. How do we do that? How do we target zero waste? Or if we are going to create waste, go back to the combination role, which is how do we recombine the waste we do produce? So waste becomes a product or a service in its own right. How do we optimize the environment? So again, this is not about making everything brilliant. It is about saying what's good enough. How can we protect, like the ants and copying? How can we take what worked last time, copy it and keep it going, even though there might be a gap between the two? So cut and paste is good as opposed to everything has to be original. So how do we cut and paste everything? And then finally, how do we minimize the competition? So done either by moving away from where the competition is or changing who is a competitor, and is the person who takes your waste a competitor, or are they now working with you in a partnership? And of course, nature has a relationship that is more than just getting to know your neighbor. So let me give you a practical application, and I want to base that on the crab. So the crab's got an interesting model of growth. It has, as you'll know, a crab has a hard shell. So all the muscles, internal systems, blood, nervous system, everything else is within the shell. So the shell is hard and everything else is soft. But to grow, of course, with a hard shell, it doesn't expand. So you need to think about how that crab can grow. And the way it does it, it has a system where if you imagine the crab and the body of the crab and the top of the crab is the lid, it's a carapace that's essentially glued on with proteins. And what the crab does when the internal organs are pressed right against the shell, it releases several hormones, one of which starts to release enzymes which digest the carapace glue, so it's loosening the lid, and at the same time it starts to bring in much more water internally, so that brings a turgor pressure. So we've now got increasing pressure with inside the shell and a loosening lid, and I'm sure you can see at a point the pressure is great enough and the lid will be loosened enough for the crab to be fired out of that shell. And if you ever walk along the beach and you see the bottom half of the crab and the legs and the base, then nearby the lid, that's because the crab's gone through this process called molting or ecdysis. And this molting process is its mechanism to grow. So biologically, what's also happening is that it's growing its new shell as a skin inside, so it's soft, a bit like wearing your outdoor coat underneath your indoor jacket, so it's all crunched up inside. And it's recycling minerals from its old shell into this new skin inside, and it's also continuing to pump in the water. So once it's fired out, it then goes through a bit like blowing up a rubber glove, so it just keeps pumping the water in till the glove is pumped up. In this case, the new skin is pumped up and it's rigid. It then holds that for about 2 weeks whilst it remineralizes and hardens, and that's the new shell. And then at that point it slowly releases the extra water it's been taking on board, so it releases the internal pressure. And the difference now between the internal organs and muscles and nerves and blood supply and the shell, there's about a 30% increase in the size of the crab. And that's the growth for the next cycle, and typically a 4-year cycle, a crab will go through about 18 of those ecdysis or molting cycles. So if we now think about that and apply that as for leadership and behavior, and we think it about as a leadership strengths model, the existing crab is its current success. So that's a successful position where it's had where its shell has provided its success for protection and defense and motility, attracting other crabs, and a whole load of functions that define effectively the crab as a successful organism. But the crab has this ambition to grow, and to grow it's got to go through the biological process. So it's got to take what's working for it so far. So it takes the minerals and it takes materials. It then recycles those. It then combines it with new material from outside, and then it builds that into the new shape, and that gives the growth. And importantly, what it does is it throws away the old shell. And if we to apply that now as a leadership model, we can think about, first of all, let's define our future growth goal or our ambition. So we'll start with that and identify a number of strengths. So if you want to now follow along as a bit of a template, you can. So if you think about yourself or your team, business, or a partnership you have with another organization, start to say, right, what are the things that I'm going to need to have in place as the key strengths around leadership and leadership behaviors, and make a list of those, maybe 4 or 5. Then look at where you are today and say, great, now I understand that. Tell me what I've got. What have I got today in terms of my strengths that got me to this point? What got me to today's success? And make a list again, and maybe 4 or 5 of those. Then from that, think about what you defined as the future growth, and look for what's in common between the two. So where you've identified a strength that's in common, just make a note of that and say, great, this is the strength I've got today and it needs to be with me in the future, so that's something I need to continue to grow and develop and manage. There may be some on the list where you think, well, it kind of got me today, but it's not really what's in the sort of center of what I do now, but it's something I had in the past and I've kind of got it today. So that's something you'd really want to develop. So you just make a list of that and say, here are the strengths I've got, not maybe where I'd want them to be, but I need to develop them. Then move on to new strengths. Well, what have I got now in my original list for the growth, which is something I haven't done now, or haven't done for such a long time that I don't really use those strengths, or haven't development, or they don't exist. So these are, let's call them new strengths that you need to develop. So let's add that to the list and say, here are the new ones. So now what we've got is the existing strengths that you'll need for the future. So we're going to keep those. We've got some of them that need a bit of development and improvement. So we've now identified what they are. We've identified the new things that we haven't got at all, or they've been such a long time since we had them that we really need to start again. And we've now got a list of all the strengths that we need to help us deliver the growth. So that's great. So you've probably got a list of 7 or 8, maybe more, strengths that's your game plan for you to deliver your leadership. And when I say strengths, I'm thinking not only skills, which is an easy list to write, but the behaviors that got you to this point. And for most of you who are working in a senior role right now, there will be communication, relationship management, understanding complexity. There'll be a whole load of things that will just sit in that space that you currently have developed or are developing or need to develop. But the important part of this is where it comes back to the crab. The crab throws away the old shell. So you now need to go back and ruthlessly go through the strengths that you've identified that you've got today and say, how do I start to spend less time with those strengths, develop them less, work on them less, reduce the importance? So if you've, just to exaggerate to make a point, if you got to where you are now because you've had technical skills and your leadership skills are developing and you're now in a role whereby it's less about your technical skill and much more about judgment and creating dynamic teams and working across organization boundaries and relationship management, then perhaps the technical skill and the technical conference every year is of less importance, and what is more important is some of the wider stakeholder groups. So maybe a different type of conference or a different type of training or just a different place to work. Change your workspace to somewhere else. So if we just recap on where we've got to so far in this podcast, we've started to look at nature and how that can be an inspiration for leadership and behaviors, start to set a context for environment, which are about principles around nature, such as using waste as a resource, material sparingly, diversification and cooperation, working together, gathering and using energy efficiently, optimize rather than maximize, run on information, clean up, don't pollute, remain in balance with the environment, and use only local resources. So we have that, and we've looked at the difference between how we as leaders would solve problems and how nature solves problems, and see that nature makes much more use of information, structure, space and time rather than energy and substance. So we need to switch our thinking into that space. And then we've looked at how we can take our strengths and use leadership strengths using a past casting model and say, what are the things I need to work on now for the future? And importantly, what I need to cast. So I'm going to wrap up the podcast now. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you can think about the crab and how the crab can help you be a better leader. Thank you. You can find more podcasts on www.biologize.co.uk, and coming shortly will be a number of training courses on applying the models, the templates, and other tools and techniques. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again on a future episode of Biologize.